lesson from the story for today, which is found in the book of Numbers, the 13th and 14th chapters. When was the last time you opened up the book of Numbers? And the Lord said to Moses, "Send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders." And at the end of 40 days, they returned from exploring the land. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. And there they reported to them, to the whole assembly, and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account: "We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large." And then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack these people. They are stronger than we are." And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they'd explored. And they said, "The land we explored devours those living in it, and all the people we saw there are of great size." And that night all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. And all the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to each other, "We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt." And then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly gathered there. Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite assembly, "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us." And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "How long will this wicked community grumble against me? I have heard the complaints of these grumbling Israelites. So tell them, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very thing I heard you say. In this wilderness, your bodies will fall. Every one of you, 20 years old or more, who was counted in the census and who has grumbled against me, not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. As for your children that you said would be taken as plunder, I will bring them in to enjoy the land you have rejected. But as for you, your bodies will fall in this wilderness. Your children will be shepherds here for 40 years, suffering for your unfaithfulness, until the last of your bodies lies in the wilderness. For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explored the land, you will suffer for your sins and know what it's like to have me against you." Well, it's Memorial Day weekend, and right on cue, just about every other year, the powers of be, they raise the gas prices. Just as everybody, gets ready to hit the road for the summer. It's pretty much American tradition, Memorial Day, high gas prices. Folks, when I say the word road trip, I'm sure that there's not a single one of us that phrase doesn't sort of conjure up some images. I can't help but think of Chevy Chase, the Griswold family, all those insane adventures they had driving cross country in that big wood-paneled station wagon towards everybody's favorite amusement park, old Wally World, and that National Lampoon vacation movie. We've all had our fair share of experiences in the road trips of life. The other day, the all-wise and knowing Facebook flashed up some pictures of the anniversary of a memorable road trip for me 2 years ago here in May. In about 6 weeks, I was going to be starting a new job in a strange new place called Michigan. About the same time, our son Jordan was getting ready to move out to Seattle. So before life was going to change drastically for both of us, we decided to take a little road trip. It's going to require driving cross country, 4 straight days, 600 miles a day. All of Jordan's stuff was in this big U-Haul truck. His car was on a trailer being towed behind, so off we went, dad and son, enjoying life on the road. We enjoyed some tasty tunes, and we reminisced about the days of old. Speaking of a Michigander, right? We made it past Chicago the first day into Iowa. Second day, we just made it into South Dakota. And at a gas station, as we were pulling out, we heard this god-awful screeching noise, only to discover that we had burned up a wheel bearing back in that car trailer. And seeing as how U-Haul couldn't get us another trailer for 2 more days, our best laid plans, they had to be scrapped. So for the last 1,500 miles, Jordan drove the truck. I drove his car behind. So much for father-son bonding time. Life on the road, huh? It's not the destination, it's the journey, right? And folks, for the last 6 weeks, we've been on our own road trip as a people, as we've been making our way through this book called The Story. We've journeyed through a beautiful garden, and then out the gates of that garden, we went into some pretty thorn-infested places. Yeah, since doing life in a garden didn't seem to work out too well, God came up with another plan. Hey, how about we build a nation? So over the last several weeks, we've sort of gone on our biblical version of an ancient antique road tour. We hit the road with an old couple named Abraham and Sarah as they journeyed by faith from ancient Mesopotamia to this new land called Canaan. And then we journeyed with Abraham's great-grandson, Joseph, to Egypt. And there Abraham's descendants that we met would live for over 4 centuries. They would even become slaves in the process. So a lot of time passes, but then our ancient antique road show seemed to hit the trail again, and God sent a deliverer. His name was Moses, and Moses led God's people out of slavery, out from Egypt, across the Red Sea, into freedom. And so now after several centuries, they seem to be back on track again. And the Israelites, they're making their way towards that promised land. But just then, God, he unveils this new twist. He now wants to come back down and do life with his people there on the road. But in order to do that, he says, hey, I'm going to need 3 things from you. We talked about these last weeks. I'm going to need first some clay, a set of road rules called the 10 Commandments, written by the very finger of God on some clay tablets, some clay, and then a place to stay. We talked about the building of this portable tent called the tabernacle where God could dwell. Some clay, a place to stay, and then we talked about a way to pay, the shedding of the blood of unblemished animals to cover or atone for Israel's sin. Well, needless to say, we know that road trips together sometimes require working some things out. If you don't, sort of as we've seen with a lot of rock bands out on road tours, they tend to break up. Life on the road can be tough. So God made a way so that he and Israel could get along together. Some clay, a place to stay, and a way to pay for their sins. So now, having sort of worked out the arrangements of life together on the road, it was time to punch in the GPS coordinates, make a run for the border of the promised land. And as is typical of any road trip, just like for my son and I, you're going to face some trials, some challenges along the way. The road can be long and tiring, and tempers can flare and patience grows thin. I mean, we can only put up with so many verses of 99 bottles of whatever on the wall, right? Before we've had enough. We can only take so many, Dad, she's touching me. And Mom, would you tell him to stop making all those strange bodily noises? Yeah, we can only take so much of that. Then there's the inevitable bathroom breaks that slow down the momentum of the trip, seemingly every hour. Too many for my taste. There's the stir craziness, and there's the sheer boredom. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? And of course, there's the all too familiar wrong turns. We all have our stories. Boy, do we have our stories. But then multiply that by some unbelievably unexpected number, because you're old Daddy Moses and you've got a couple of million Israelite kids and they're sitting there in the back seat. I mean, what would you do if you were Moses driving through the Badlands of the mother of all road trips? What would that be like? Well, maybe it would be sort of like this. Let's watch.
This man right here is my great-grandfather. He's the first cat herder in our family.
Herding cats. Don't let anybody tell you it's easy.
Anybody can herd cattle. Holding together 10,000 half-wild short hairs, well, that's another thing altogether.
Being a cat herder is probably about the toughest thing I think I've ever done.
I got this one this morning, right here, and if you look at his face, it's just ripped to shreds, you know?
You see the movies, you hear the stories, I'm living a dream. Not everyone can do what we do.
I wouldn't do nothing else.
It ain't an easy job, but when you bring a herd into town and you ain't lost a one of them, ain't a feeling like it in the world.
Yeah, it's sort of like herding cats. Well, let's recall, folks, that things, had actually started out pretty well. At first, they must have had that same sense of expectancy that we all have when we're about to head out on a road trip. Let's keep in mind, they'd all camped at the ancient version of a KOA campground. There they were at the base of Mount Sinai for an entire year. Cabin fever starts to set in. And so just to bring some sort of order to such a big undertaking, God instructs Father Moses, divide up the caravan of a couple of million cats or kids, put them into 12 tribes. Let's name each of them after one of Jacob's 12 sons. As you remember, Jacob's name gets changed over to Israel after wrestling with that angel. And each of these tribes was to be visually represented by this giant banner. And God also said, make 2 trumpets out of silver to signal your departure time each day. So finally, after all their waiting, imagine their excitement when on the 20th day of the 12th month of the 2nd year after they have left Egypt, that the trumpet blast, it echoes there across the campground, this divine cloud of God's presence from the tabernacle. It rises up and it signals, yeehaw, rawhide. Yeah, we're on our way. And so they went off. It had to be exhilarating. I expect Moses must have been thinking, it's finally going to happen. God is going to show us the way. We're finally going to get out of this wilderness. And yet, guess what? That kind of happy thinking, guess how long it lasted? 3 days. The contrast It couldn't be sharper, because in one chapter, the Bible paints for us this epic picture of each of the tribes with their banners setting out from that campground, heading towards the promised land. And then we read on page 71 of the story, and then the people complained about their hardships in the hearing of the Lord, and when God heard them, his anger was aroused. Yeah, for the briefest time, Israel was able to enter that upper story we've been talking about of a God who keeps his promises. But just like on Memorial Day weekend, when you and I, we pause and we remember. So this nation, they paused and they remembered how they had started out as this motley band of 70 when they arrived there in Egypt over 400 years before, and yet just as God promised, they had grown in number, and here they were now about ready to get their own land. Wow, it was really going to happen. And yet all too soon, they fall back into this tunnel vision of lower story thinking. It's hot, it's dusty, we're tired, it's taking longer than we thought it was going to take, God. 3 days into the road trip, and they're whining and complaining. So just like with your own parents, what they would do, they'd reach back and they'd swat you, they're in the back seat when you get out of hand. God does one better. Because according to the story, he sends fire down from heaven. He shoots a warning shot across Israel's bow. He singes the outskirts of the camp, and although no one gets hurt, nevertheless, it was still a clear signal. Hey, settle down, kids. Though the fire got their attention, it didn't last for long. Well, I remember back about 35 years ago, it's hard to believe, I was in college. It's the early 80s. Imagine my haircut back then. I actually had hair back then. A Christian artist by the name of Keith Green was my favorite. Old Keith did an album back then. It was called So You Want to Go Back to Egypt. It was hilarious. It was sort of this satirical look at how ridiculous Israel was behaving. So not long after this whole fire from heaven incident, there they are back at it again. And next thing we know, they're whining over the cuisine on this pleasure cruise. Miraculously, God does provide for them this bread-like substance, manna. So Keith Green, he comes up with all kinds of creative ideas on how they must have used that stuff. Dishes like manna bread and manna cotti and the irresistible manna burgers. Basically, each day manna would fall down from heaven. It would feed them all. How thoughtful of you, God. And yet before long, what do? They start whining about the lack of variety in their diet. And they begin pining after those so-called good old days back there in Egypt. We read once again in the story. If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost, and the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna. In his album, Keith Green, he sang, eating leeks and onions by the Nile. Ooh, what breath. But dining out in style. Yeah. They fell into what some have called the myth of nostalgia. It was all about revisionist history. Yeah, weren't those days of slavery back there in Egypt just so wonderful, wonderful? Nah. Folks, they were god-awful. So now they not only want manna, they want meat, and really, what is it that they actually want? They want control. They don't want to have to trust God for something as basic as their daily menu. He gives them manna. He gives them the food of angels. He gives them quail, a delicacy, and yet all they can do is complain. You know, folks, what happens next? It sort of reminds me of what some wise dads have done with their teenagers. Maybe you face this, you get caught smoking. So old dad produces a pack of cigarettes and he says, "Son, you want to smoke? Okay. Start smoking." He hands you a cigarette. You smoke it. Then he hands you another, and then another, and then another, until finally you're puking your guts out. So when God hears his people whining about the manna, asking for more meat, what does he do? Well, he gives it to them in bushels till it comes out their nostrils. And that's exactly what he tells his ungrateful children will happen to those who insist on having their own way instead of his way. And so you'd think after this firestorm from heaven, after a couple of nights of indigestion from too much meat, that the Israelites would have finally gotten the message. God is saying, I'll do what I'll say I will do. And why? So you can enjoy the journey. And of course, when they were slaves back there in Egypt, they worked from dawn to dusk, and they always found out that if they didn't work hard enough, they were beaten. And most of all, they felt completely abandoned by God. And so what did God do? He not only rescued them from their misery, but he made his presence known in the most tangible means possible, by means of this cloud that hovered over the tabernacle. It was like this big billboard that said, hey folks, I'm right here with you. And all you need to do is to follow me. And everything will be all right. And yet guess what? Still, they complained. Because after that whole eating quail till you're pale incident, Moses' own siblings even get in on the act. They begin questioning Moses' leadership. It seems that God had made it abundantly clear that his whole plan was to be communicated through Moses, but apparently some sibling rivalry had crept in, and now Aaron and Miriam, they start spouting off about how God also wanted to speak through them. You see, once again, it points to more than just a case of sibling rivalry. It points to a lack of trust in God's navigating skills. So just as a reminder, he gives Miriam a little love tap. She's inflicted, get this, with leprosy. When Aaron intercedes and says, Brother Moses, talk to God, they get the point. Moses has a special relationship with the Father. You know, folks, when we read of such incidents in the Bible, from our lower story perspectives, it's tempting sometimes to conclude, that God is mean-spirited. He enjoys punishing us. I mean, so what if Miriam and Aaron were a little jealous? Can we really blame them? What harm is there in a little grumbling? Brothers and sisters do that all the time. But as it turns out, from an upper story perspective, what God is doing is he's building a special nation. One that's supposed to be different. It's like the Apostle Peter reminds us in the New Testament. He says, we are supposed to be a peculiar people. We're supposed to be different from all of the other peoples on the face of the earth. Israel was to be a people worthy of God's presence. And that's to say, folks in other nations, they whined and complained. People in other lands, they were never satisfied. Citizens of other countries, they got jealous. But God's people had to be different because they were a direct reflection on the very character of their God to all of those who were around them, either attracting or repelling them. Such a nation could only succeed if they totally trusted in their God, even when things sometimes did not make much sense. And yet, for the Israelites, wandering around in the wilderness with only manna to eat, it wasn't exactly their idea of being a chosen nation. And neither was the incident that we read about in today's lesson. We heard about it. After a long, exhausting road trip, they finally reached the border of the promised land. Amen, hallelujah, we're finally there. And so they send in 12 spies, one from each tribe. You know, sort of case out the joints. 40 days later, they come back with this report, and two of them, Joshua and Caleb, they come back and they say, just as God promised, is this land flowing with milk and honey, ripe for the picking. But despite everything that the other 10 had seen and heard, all the miraculous power of their God, his concern for them, still, what happens? They come back and listen to their report. We can't attack these people. They are stronger than we are. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there, giants, and we seemed like grasshoppers to them. So as we read, because of their repeated lack of faith, because they could never seem to see beyond the muck and the mire of their lower stories, to look up and see God's upper story plan, God consigns them to spend 40 more years wandering in the wilderness, a time in which all of those 20 years and older, except for Joshua and Caleb, would die in the wilderness. So folks, at least 1 million or more Israelites die on that long, hard road trip, their bodies buried there in the wilderness. Talk about a detour. And all because they aren't willing to listen to the voice of their divine GPS. Yeah. Their lower story expectations, they kept getting in the way of the upper story's developments. And can you relate? Maybe it's unemployment. Maybe it's a troubled marriage, a painful illness, a stress-inducing debt, or maybe you've wrestled down here in the lower story with all of the changes that we've had to go through as a congregation in the last couple of years. And friends, the Israelites, they kept forgetting that God always keeps his promises. That land flowing with milk and honey was always theirs to begin with. And while that journey might have seemed long and hard, he was right there with them every step of the way, just as he's right here with us now in our own difficult journeys. So how does this week's chapter of the story end? 40 more years pass by, and now Moses and a whole new generation of his people, once again, they stand there at the border of the same promised land that they could have had before. And Moses, he's near the end of his life, and he knows that he will not be allowed to enter that land. The baton is being passed to Joshua. But at the end, Moses gathers the people. And let me tell you, for a guy who tried to convince God not to choose him as a leader because he couldn't speak very well, he ends up crafting one of the most inspiring messages of the whole Bible. Folks, Coach Bo Schembechler had nothing on this guy. That's hard to say, being an Ohio boy. So they finally are on the verge, after a 650-year U-turn, of getting what God had promised to Abraham all of those years before. And Moses, he knows these people well. He's watched them make more wrong turns than Willie Nelson again and again. So he presents them with two alternatives. Hey, folks, love God, obey him, and you will live prosperously in the land. But turn away from God and disobey him and suffer destruction. Folks, on the road trip that we call life, choose to ride with God and you will receive his promises. But choose to go your own way and live by your own rules, and it will be crash and burn, baby. I mean, who would ever not choose such a good life? Lots. God wants us to enjoy the journey with him as much as getting to the destination. And just as 3,500 years ago, when we refused to do that, guess what? He's forced to correct our behavior. Like a father sitting there in the front seat of the car on life's faith road trip, he wants the very best for us, even if it means pulling the car over and making us face the temporary discomfort of being disciplined right alongside the roadside of life. But we trust him. When we are impatient and we ask from the back seat, hey, well, when are we going to get to our lower story destination? Well, we grumble and whine and complain. Remember, we're to be a peculiar people. We're to be different. Have we arrived? Are we there yet? Hardly. So just sit back and trust. And enjoy the ride. Because old Dad's up there in the front seat. He knows exactly where we're going and how to get us there. And as one old country singer put it, all we have to do is what? Let Jesus take the wheel. Right? Pray with me. Father, help us as we wander through our own wildernesses to trust you, to let you take the wheel. Show us the way. We know you've got a plan. Help us to get out of the muck of this lower story, to see your upper story plan for us. We give you thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.